What if I told you that you were born without a purpose, that there's no essence waiting for you, and that the full responsibility of giving your life meaning is entirely in your hands? For Jean-Paul Sartre, this isn't just an idea, it's a sentence. We are condemned to be free. No excuses, no written destiny, just choices, and the crushing weight they carry. Today, you're going to discover Sartre's philosophy, a way of thinking that can either set you free or completely shatter your illusions. Imagine being born without a manual, no written destiny, no role to play, no fixed nature telling you who you're supposed to be. Just you, your existence, and the world ahead of you. For Jean-Paul Sartre, this isn't just a poetic idea. It's the true nature of being human. When he says that existence precedes essence, he's tearing down centuries of religious and philosophical thinking. Instead of being born with a set purpose, a given identity, humans show up in the world first, raw, unfinished, wide open, and only later, through the choices they make, do they start to define who they are. This idea sits at the heart of existentialism. Unlike objects we create, like a knife or a pen, that are made with a specific purpose in mind, humans don't come into the world with any built-in function. We aren't the product of some divine craftsman who gave us meaning before we were even born. Sartre writes, "Man exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards." That means there's no single right way to be human that's already set before our lives begin. It's through our actions and decisions that we write our own story. It's a liberating thought, but also terrifying. Because if there's no essence before existence, then there are no excuses. No metaphysical crutches to lean on. You can't say, "I was born this way," or "I'm just a product of my environment." To Sartre, that's bad faith, a way of running from your freedom. And this freedom is absolute. It's what defines us. We're not just free to choose, we are freedom. That's why Sartre says we're condemned to be free. Even if we never asked to be born, now that we're here, we're fully responsible for what we do with our existence. But this freedom isn't abstract. It plays out in real life. Sartre gives an example from World War II. A young Frenchman came to him looking for guidance. The man was torn. Stay home to take care of his sick mother or join the resistance to fight the Nazis. No moral rule could give him a clear answer. Religion might tell him to care for his mother or to sacrifice himself for others. Kant's moral philosophy, built on universal principles, also failed in the face of such complexity. Sartre's answer was clear. No one could decide for him. The choice was his, and that choice, made in the silence of his own freedom, would define who he was. From this, we reach an unavoidable conclusion. There's no universal moral code that fits every situation. The value of an action isn't in following external rules. It's in owning the responsibility of choosing. When someone makes a choice, they're saying to the world, "This is what I believe a human being can be." Sartre wrote, "In choosing for myself, I choose for all men." That means our decisions are never just personal. They create an image of humanity we're putting out into the world. Here's one of the most unsettling parts of existentialism. There are no guarantees. There's no right answer waiting for us. Life doesn't come with a manual or any promises. We are the ones who must create meaning or fail trying. And this task never ends. There's no essence that stays fixed forever. We are always under construction, always incomplete, always becoming. That also means we're not prisoners of our past. It doesn't matter who you used to be. What matters is what you do now with who you are. Even when everything around you feels fixed, Sartre insists, you still have freedom. And with it comes responsibility. Every little choice, from how you speak to someone to the major life decisions, is a declaration of existence. You are not what you think or feel. you are what you do. But let's be clear, this freedom isn't a free pass for selfishness or acting on whims. Quite the opposite. It's a deep ethical calling. Because there are no external rules defining good or evil, we must create values through our actions. And those values shape the world. When you act with courage, generosity, or integrity, you're showing that this kind of human being is possible and worth striving for. When you act with cowardice, dishonesty, or cruelty, you're also sending a message. There is no neutrality. With every act, we're either building or tearing down the very idea of humanity. So, existence precedes essence isn't just a philosophical slogan. It's an existential cry, a challenge, or maybe even a demand for us to take the reins of our own lives. To embrace freedom not as a burden, but as a possibility. To become the authors of our own existence, instead of background characters in someone else's story. Because in the end, we are nothing but what we choose to be. And in that choice, that terrifying, beautiful freedom, the human being is born. Human beings are condemned to be free. This is, perhaps, one of Jean-Paul Sartre's most powerful and unsettling statements. At first glance, it sounds contradictory. How can something as desirable as freedom be a condemnation? But Sartre's choice of words is intentional. He wants to challenge us. He wants to break the romantic and comfortable idea of freedom as simply doing whatever you want. For Sartre, freedom isn't a privilege. It's an inevitable part of being human, a burden we carry simply because we exist. To be free, in Sartre's view, isn't just choosing between coffee or tea in the morning. It goes much deeper. It's the realization that nothing outside of us defines who we are. There's no preset human nature, no God writing out our fate, no inner essence whispering, "You were born for this." Everything we are is built through the choices we make, and not choosing is already a choice in itself. That's why he says we're condemned to this freedom. Because whether we like it or not, we can never escape the responsibility of being the authors of our own lives. We might try to hide behind excuses, blame our circumstances, society, our parents, our trauma. But Sartre is unforgiving. Even so, we decide what to do with what's been done to us. Freedom isn't something you can give up. It's a constant, inescapable condition. Even silence is a decision. Even passivity is a form of action. This vision of freedom is radical because it rejects all forms of determinism. Nothing, not genetics, not the unconscious, not culture, can fully explain who we are. Sartre doesn't deny that we are influenced by the world. Of course we are. We're born into a time, a culture, a history. But even within those conditions, we always have room to choose. He calls this situated freedom. You don't choose everything, but you always choose what to do with what you've been given. It's like being thrown into a chess game with pieces you didn't choose. But every move, every strategy, that's yours. And that's why freedom for Sartre is so heavy. It's not about doing whatever feels good. It's about being fully responsible for who you are and for the world you help create. Every choice carries moral weight. Every act affirms values. When I choose, I'm not just shaping my personal identity. I'm showing, through my behavior, what I think a human being can be. That makes freedom a constant act of ethical creation. But this awareness also creates anxiety. Because without a fixed essence or divine plan, there's no one left to blame. No higher authority handing us the rules. No universal moral laws coming down from above to tell us what's right. We are left with nothing but our own ability to decide. Sartre doesn't sugarcoat this. He knows how painful it is. Radical freedom is not comfortable. It's often lonely. It demands courage, because it's easier to be told what to do, to follow orders, to repeat what's already laid out. It's easier to say, "I have no choice," than to face the truth that we always have a choice, even when all the options seem bad. Sartre expresses this powerfully in his major work, Being and Nothingness. He analyzes everyday situations where people try to escape their freedom. A waiter who acts as if he's nothing more than a waiter, limited by his social role. A woman being flirted with who pretends not to notice, just to avoid having to make a decision. These are simple scenarios, but they reveal something deep. Humans often try to reduce themselves to roles, functions, or objects, just to avoid the burden of freedom. But for Sartre, that's bad faith, pretending we're not free, when in fact, we can't not be. Radical freedom also has political and social consequences. For Sartre, no philosophy is neutral. A philosopher can't hide in an ivory tower. If we are free, then we are also responsible for the world we accept, and the world we fail to change. Freedom demands engagement. We must choose, act, take a stand. Indifference is an illusion, and even that is a choice. That doesn't mean freedom is unlimited. It's always shaped by context. And this is where Sartre shows his philosophical maturity. He's not saying everyone has the same opportunities, but he is saying that even in the worst situations, freedom remains. The freedom to respond, to find meaning, to take a stand. One example is how prisoners of war resisted their oppressors emotionally and mentally, finding ways to preserve their dignity even under extreme conditions. That is freedom in its purest form, the ability not to surrender your inner self, even when everything around you tries to crush it. To accept this freedom is the first step toward living with authenticity. It's saying yes to the human condition. It means giving up the comfort of a fixed essence, a written destiny, a ready-made excuse. It means diving into the risk of choosing, of failing, of changing, of starting over. Sartre doesn't offer comfort, but he does offer clarity, and with that clarity, the possibility of living a true life, one where we don't hide from ourselves. In the end, radical freedom is a call to existential maturity. It's not a childish kind of freedom. I'll do whatever I want, and no one can stop me. It's a freedom that demands responsibility, awareness, and courage. Because if we are what we choose to be, then we have no excuses. We are the authors of our own being, and to live as if we weren't, that would be the greatest lie of all. Have you ever caught yourself saying, "I had no choice"? Have you ever hidden behind a role, a job title, or a label just to avoid making a deeper decision? Have you ever convinced yourself you were a victim of circumstance, even though deep down you knew you could have acted differently? If so, you've experienced what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith, a kind of existential self-deception that all of us at some point fall into. Bad faith, or mauvaise foi in French, is a central idea in Sartre's existentialist philosophy, especially in his work Being and Nothingness. It refers to the act of denying our own freedom, as if we were completely shaped by outside forces like culture, fate, biology, or social expectations. But the most disturbing part, we don't do this consciously. On the contrary, it's a lie we tell ourselves and believe. We pretend we're not free. We pretend we're not responsible. And we do it to avoid the terrifying weight of freedom. According to Sartre, this self-deception is a kind of escape, because facing our freedom head-on is scary. As we've seen before, we are, in his words, condemned to be free. And that freedom forces us to choose, to decide who we are, with no guarantees and no ready-made answers. But we're not always strong enough to carry that burden, so instead, we hide. We act like we're already something fixed, like the world has given us a clear identity we can't question. That's bad faith, acting like we're objects when in reality, we're consciousness, freedom, a project always in the making. One of Sartre's most famous examples of bad faith is the Parisian waiter. Picture a waiter moving with exaggerated gestures, overly formal, overly precise, anticipating what the customer wants before they even ask. He's almost performing the role of the perfect waiter. But Sartre says, he's not just a waiter. He's behaving as if that's all he is, as if his entire being is defined by that job, as if there's nothing more to him than that role. And in doing that, he's in bad faith. Why is that a problem? Because human beings, Sartre argues, are never fixed things. We're never just a role. Unlike a rock or a machine, we are consciousness. And consciousness is always in motion, always free. When we reduce ourselves to a role, father, mother, teacher, soldier, artist, we're trying to turn ourselves into objects. But we're not objects. We're subjects. We're unfinished projects. And pretending otherwise is a kind of ontological dishonesty. Bad faith doesn't only show up at work, it happens in relationships too. Sartre gives the example of a woman on a date. The man takes her hand, clearly signaling romantic interest, but instead of accepting or rejecting it, she pretends not to notice. She leaves her hand there, unmoving, acting like it's just polite formality. She separates her body from her awareness, pretending she's not really involved in what's happening. Once again, this is bad faith, denying the freedom to decide, dodging the moment where a real choice must be made. So why do we do this? Because, as we know, freedom is heavy. It demands responsibility. It forces us to admit that there are no excuses, that we are the authors of what we do, that we are always choosing who we are, and that can be overwhelming. So we protect ourselves with roles, labels, and old stories. We say, this is just how I am. I didn't have a choice. It's always been this way. And in doing so, we sacrifice our authenticity for comfort. But Sartre isn't here to judge. He's here to wake us up. Pointing out bad faith is his way of reminding us that we can choose differently, that we don't have to stay trapped in old narratives, that even when we pretend we're not free, we're still using our freedom. Bad faith also shows up at the social and political level. How often do we accept injustice by saying, that's just how the system works? How often do we repeat harmful behaviors by saying, that's just in my nature? How often do we stay silent when courage is needed, excusing ourselves by saying, that's not my problem? All of that is collective bad faith, denying moral responsibility in the name of what's normal. Recognizing bad faith in ourselves is uncomfortable, but it's also freeing. Because where there's bad faith, there's denied freedom. And where freedom is denied, there's the chance to reclaim it. Sartre wants to provoke us to step out of the role, to drop the mask, to stop pretending. He invites us to live with authenticity, not as people defined by something given, but as people who create themselves every day, with every action, every choice. That doesn't mean we have to reject our social roles. It means we have to remember we are more than them. We can play those roles with awareness, without becoming trapped by them. We can be parents, workers, friends, citizens, and still continue becoming, changing, going beyond. Because that's the nature of consciousness. It's never fixed. It's, as Sartre says, the nothingness that separates us from the world, the space where we can refuse and remake ourselves. Owning that space is the first step out of bad faith. It's what Sartre will later call authenticity. To live authentically is to reject the easy lie that we are only what happened to us. It's to fully claim our freedom with all it demands: anxiety, responsibility, risk, but also power, transformation, and creation. In the end, bad faith isn't a character flaw. It's a way of trying to escape ourselves. But Sartre reminds us, with all the force of his philosophy, that there's no real escape. There's no way to stop being free. The only thing we can stop being is honest. And maybe that's the biggest lie of all. When Jean-Paul Sartre published Being and Nothingness in 1943, he wasn't just writing a book, he was shaping the very heart of an entire philosophy. This is where existentialist ontology takes form. It's a dense, difficult, and profound work, but essential. Sartre isn't just trying to say we're free, or that existence comes before essence. He's trying to show, with deep philosophical rigor, what it means to be human, how we're different from things, how consciousness works, how we deceive ourselves, and how we become who we choose to be. The entire book revolves around two fundamental modes of being in itself, être en soi, and being for itself, être pour soi. These are complex concepts, but once you grasp them, they shed light on everything in Sartre's philosophy. Being in itself, l'être en soi, is the mode of being of things. It's what defines the physical world, solid, determined, self-contained. A rock, a tree, a chair, all are examples of being in itself. They simply exist. They're complete. They have no consciousness, no doubts, no sense of lack. They don't choose, they don't project themselves, they don't transcend. They're whole, but also passive. They have no freedom, and because of that, they feel no anguish. Being for itself, l'être pour soi, on the other hand, is the mode of consciousness, and this changes everything. Consciousness, according to Sartre, is not a thing. By definition, it's empty, negative, and open. Consciousness is the space where the world shows up, where being in itself is revealed. That's why Sartre says that consciousness is a lack of being. It's always something it is not, always reaching beyond, negating, desiring. Unlike being in itself, which simply is what it is, being for itself is what it is not, and is not what it is. It may sound like wordplay, but it holds deep existential meaning. Consciousness is never fixed. It's always in motion. It's a project. It's freedom. When I look in the mirror and say, "This is who I am," I'm already lying, because what I see is just a frozen image. But my consciousness, who I truly am, is everything that goes beyond that image. It's what desires to be something else. It's what is still becoming. That's why Sartre says human beings are a lack of being. We're not something already given. We are the ongoing effort to create ourselves, to reinvent ourselves. And it's in the gap between what we are now and what we could become that freedom is born. And with it, anguish. That's what gives the book its title, Being and Nothingness. Because consciousness is the nothing inside being. It's the crack in solid reality. It's the point where the world splits open, where being starts to question itself, where the individual not only exists but becomes aware of that existence. Without this nothing, there would be no freedom, no choice. We'd be like rocks, whole but lifeless. But freedom comes at a price. Because if we are consciousness, then we are never truly something. We are never someone in a final, definitive way. We are always what is yet to come, what hasn't been fully realized, and that can be dizzying. So we often try to escape this condition of being for itself. We try to freeze ourselves, to reduce ourselves to fixed identities, to social roles, to labels that make us feel safe. And when we do that, we fall into bad faith. We pretend we're like things, as if we could be neatly defined. But the truth of human existence, for Sartre, is exactly the opposite. We're never finished. We're always in the making. Here's a simple example to make it clear. Imagine a glass sitting on a table. That glass is being in itself. It's there. It is what it is. It serves its purpose, and that's it. Now imagine a person looking at that glass, thinking whether to pick it up, fill it, break it, or just ignore it. That person isn't just being. They are engaging with the world, making choices, creating possibilities. That's being for itself. And that difference changes everything. Because where there's being for itself, there's a world, there's direction, there's purpose, there's a future. Sartre goes even further. He says human beings carry within themselves an impossible desire, the desire to be both being in itself and being for itself. In other words, to be both a thing and consciousness. To have the completeness of being in itself and the freedom of being for itself. We want to be free, but also defined. We want total control, but without the anxiety. We want to be something, but without giving up the openness of becoming. This, for Sartre, is the root of bad faith and existential frustration. because it's impossible. The human being by nature cannot be a thing. We are, by definition, unfinished. This ontology, this explanation of being, isn't some empty theory. It has deep implications for life. It reminds us that we are not statues. We are not complete. To be human is, by necessity, to be free. And denying that freedom is to run away from ourselves. Sartre invites us to recognize this condition and to embrace it with courage. Being and Nothingness is not an easy book, but it's not meant to be memorized. It's meant to be lived. Every page is a mirror, a challenge, an invitation to radical honesty. And maybe that's its greatest strength, showing us that existence is not something we suffer. It's something we create. We are not spectators of our lives. We are the authors. And as long as we are conscious, the nothing within us will continue to open up new possibilities, calling us to choose, to act, to become, even if that becoming never ends. When we think about consciousness, we usually picture it as something full of thoughts, emotions, ideas, memories. But Jean-Paul Sartre invites us to look at it from another angle, one that's unsettling yet deeply revealing. For him, consciousness is defined by nothingness. It's not a vault where things are stored, but an open, empty space, one that can deny, refuse, and go beyond. Human consciousness isn't just presence, it's also absence, and it's exactly because of that absence that we are free. At the heart of this idea is a bold claim. The fundamental structure of consciousness is negative, not in the sense of being bad or destructive, but in the sense that it is not equal to what it is, and it can stop being what it currently is. In other words, consciousness is the power to say no. It's the power to reject the world as it appears. And it's this no that allows us to choose, to change direction, to refuse what's imposed on us. This nothingness is what separates us from the rest of existence, from things, from brute facts, from the world as is. Sartre develops this idea in Being and Nothingness, especially when analyzing the ordinary experience of everyday life. One of his examples is simple but powerful. A man is supposed to meet a friend at a cafe at 4 p.m. He arrives, looks around at all the tables, and realizes his friend isn't there. But think about that. How do you perceive an absence? What exactly is he seeing? Nothing. His friend isn't there. But this nothing, this absence, is produced by consciousness. The cafe is full, the tables are occupied, the space is buzzing, but the man feels a hole, a gap, the gap of unmet expectation. That gap is nothingness, and only human consciousness can experience it. This is what radically separates us from the world of objects. Things just are. They exist, they take up space, they follow physical laws. But we, on the other hand, are not just what we are. We are what negates, what changes, what distances itself from being. Human beings are the only entities who can ask, do I really have to keep being this way? A stone doesn't question itself. A dog doesn't reject its own nature. But we can break away from what we've been given. We can transcend. And that power to transcend comes from the nothingness inside our consciousness. This ability to negate is what allows us to imagine the future, to project possibilities, to desire what doesn't yet exist, because the nothing in our consciousness makes room for what could be. When someone says, I don't want to live like this anymore, they're separating from the present, breaking with the now, reaching for a different future. That's more than just a thought. It's an act of freedom. Nothingness, then, becomes the engine of our transcendence. It keeps us from becoming stuck, closed, or final. But as always in Sartre, freedom brings anxiety, because the same nothingness that sets us free also threatens us. It shows us that nothing holds us up completely. Behind our roles, our routines, our certainties, there's a gap, an emptiness that never fully goes away. And many of us, instead of facing that truth, try to run from it. We try to fill the emptiness with distractions, with dogmas, with ready-made identities. We pretend we are fixed, finished, determined. These are all attempts to silence the nothing, and along with it, freedom. Sartre sees this clearly. Whenever consciousness tries to become a thing, when it tries to be something, in a final and definitive way, it's trying to erase this nothingness, to close its own openness. But that's impossible. Nothingness is structural. It's always there. We're condemned to deal with it. And paradoxically, that condemnation is what saves us from being just things. It's what keeps us human. If consciousness were only full, if it were completely fused with the world, there'd be no space for choice, for ethics, for change. We'd be like machines, only reacting to what happens around us. But that's not what we are. We are beings who can stop, think, reject, choose another path. We can say no, even when everything around us says yes. We can reject a destiny, a role, an expectation, and that is extraordinary. Nothingness is also present in our relationships. When we realize we are not what others think we are, when there's always something more, something ungrasped, some freedom that escapes definition. That space between how others see us and who we really are is what lets us resist and reinvent ourselves. Our consciousness doesn't belong to someone else's gaze. It carries this nothing that separates us from the world and allows us to build ourselves. This idea may sound abstract, but it lives in every real human experience. When someone breaks a cycle of family violence, they're saying, "I don't have to repeat what was done to me." When someone leaves a stable job to follow a dream, they're saying, "I'm more than this role or title." When someone says enough in an abusive relationship, they're recognizing their distance from the situation. They're accessing the nothing. And right there, exactly there, freedom is born. For Sartre, nothingness is not an empty void without meaning. It's the very possibility of creation, of change, of starting again. It's the space between who we are and who we still might become. It's what keeps life from becoming pure repetition. It's what forces us to choose, to act, to give meaning to the world. That's why Sartre doesn't fear the nothing. He embraces it as the very structure of consciousness. There is no consciousness without negation, no freedom without emptiness, and no true humanity without this silent nothingness that lives within us. Have you ever felt that sinking feeling in your stomach when you realize life is in your hands? That strange sense that everything depends on you, your choices, your path, who you're going to become. That feeling isn't a flaw. In fact, it's a powerful sign that you're waking up to something essential. Existential anguish. And for Jean-Paul Sartre, this anguish isn't a weakness of the soul, it's the price of freedom. As we've seen in previous lessons, freedom is the core of the human condition. Sartre reminds us, human beings are condemned to be free. But that condemnation isn't a punishment, it's a reality. We didn't ask to be born, we didn't choose the world we came into, but once we're here, we're fully responsible for what we do with our existence. There's no preset nature, no instruction manual telling us who we should be. No value comes from the outside. No God hands us a ready-made script. It's just us, alone, faced with the task of creating the meaning of our own lives. And that, inevitably, brings anguish. Existential anguish isn't the same as fear. Fear has an object. We fear something specific. Losing a job, someone dying, an accident happening. But anguish doesn't have a face. It comes from freedom itself. It's the vertigo we feel when we realize there's no solid ground under our feet. That in the end, we're alone when it comes to choosing. And that every decision we make defines not just our life, but what we believe it means to be human. Sartre uses a powerful image to explain this. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a cliff. You look down and feel a chill. Sure, there's fear of falling, but there's something even more disturbing. You realize you could jump, that nothing, except your own decision, is stopping you from making one wrong move. This awareness that you are free, that at any moment you can radically change your life, is what creates anguish. It's the realization that ultimately nothing protects us from ourselves. And it's not just about big life decisions like moving to another country, ending a marriage, or quitting your job. Anguish shows up in small, everyday moments. When you say yes to something you don't want, when you stay silent in the face of injustice, when you let an opportunity pass out of fear. In all these moments, you're exercising your freedom and often trying to escape it at the same time. Sartre is clear. Anguish is how freedom appears in our awareness, and there's no way to escape it without lying to ourselves. We may try to hide behind roles, traditions, religions, ideologies. We may pretend we're just following orders or doing what everyone else is doing. But deep down, we know we are the ones choosing, always. Even when we choose to follow a rule or submit to tradition, that submission is still a choice. And that's where the anguish comes in, because it shows us there are no guarantees, no excuses, no one else to blame. But that doesn't mean life is just a meaningless void. On the contrary, for Sartre, anguish isn't something to avoid. It's something to understand and embrace. It's the clearest sign that we are free, that we're not objects in the world, but conscious beings who can choose, create, and change. To feel anguish is to realize you're truly alive, to stand face to face with the responsibility of reinventing yourself every day. In Existentialism Is a Humanism, Sartre responds to critics who called existentialism a philosophy of despair. He replies, "It's not out of cowardice that we resign ourselves, but because anguish runs deep. Anguish is the proof that freedom is real. When you feel anguish, you're facing a real choice. You're aware that there's no pre-written formula. You're touching the raw depth of existence. And for Sartre, that's what makes us human. The problem isn't anguish. The problem is what we do with it. Some people run. They fall into bad faith, cling to fixed roles, hide behind masks. Others freeze, waiting for something outside themselves to tell them what to do. But then there are those who look anguish in the eye and keep going anyway, who understand that there's no perfect path, but it's still worth choosing, acting, failing, trying again, who realize that freedom is hard, but beautiful, because it allows us to build a life with real meaning. Existential anguish isn't a roadblock, it's part of the road, a sign that you're facing the truth of your condition. When you wake up and feel like something needs to change but you don't know where to start. When you feel a heaviness in your chest because you're living a life you didn't choose. When you sense that you're being carried by inertia, but you want to grab the wheel. That's anguish speaking. And if you really listen, you'll realize it's not trying to paralyze you. It's trying to call you back to yourself. Sartre doesn't offer easy comfort, but he does offer clarity. He reminds us that we're not here to repeat the past or to follow someone else's script. We're here to build, with our own hands, a life that is truly ours. And anguish is the signal that we still have that power, that we are still free, that even now, after everything, we can still say yes or no. And with that choice, write the story of who we are. You don't live just for yourself. Even when you act alone, even when no one is watching, your actions quietly send a message to the world. This is what I believe a human being can be. Jean-Paul Sartre reminds us that every choice we make, no matter how personal it may seem, carries a weight that goes far beyond our own life. For him, freedom never comes alone. It always comes with a deep and inescapable responsibility. The responsibility not only for who you are, but for what you're suggesting to the world as a vision of humanity. In existentialist philosophy, human beings are not born with a fixed essence. As we've already seen, existence comes before essence. We are what we choose to become. And this act of choosing yourself is never neutral. It's not just about picking a career, a lifestyle, or a belief system. It's a silent but powerful commitment to a certain idea of what it means to be human. When you act, you're saying, this is valid, this is worthwhile, this is possible for a human being. You don't just build yourself through your decisions, you also shape, symbolically, the meaning of humanity itself. Sartre puts it seriously. In choosing for myself, I choose for all of humanity. That doesn't mean your choices become a universal law. It means that when you choose consciously, you are offering a way of being. Through your body, your gestures, your words, you're saying, this is a legitimate way to live. And that message, even if it's never written down, echoes in the invisible fabric of society. That's why Sartre never treats freedom as light or superficial. On the contrary, he insists, we are entirely responsible for who we are. Not because we control everything, but because we give meaning to whatever happens to us. We decide how to respond. Even in the hardest situations, there's still a choice. And that choice defines us. And by defining us, it projects an image of what a human being can be. Think of someone who chooses to live honestly in a place where lying is the easier path. That person, through that act, is saying, truth is still possible, even here. When someone chooses to resist oppression, knowing they might lose, they're saying, freedom is still worth the risk. When someone forgives, helps, or shows compassion, even when they have every reason to shut down, they're declaring, kindness is still a human option. These actions go beyond the individual. They become living examples, proof that certain values still exist. But this works in the other direction too. When we lie, betray, stay silent, abandon, we're not just failing ourselves. We're validating a darker vision of what humans are. We're saying those actions are acceptable, possible, even normal. That's why Sartre strongly rejects any excuse that blames human nature, instinct, or culture. For him, you are what you choose to make of yourself. Every single act, no matter how small, is an ethical statement to yourself and to the world. This understanding forces us to give up the mindset of victimhood. Of course, life has limits. There's injustice, inequality, trauma. But for Sartre, that doesn't remove responsibility. It deepens it. Because it's in hardship that freedom becomes clearest. We are free within our situation, not outside of it. And it's inside those real, limited situations that we decide how we're going to respond. We are the authors of the meaning we give to what happens. Responsibility doesn't mean being perfect. It doesn't mean never making mistakes. It means not running from the authorship of your own life. It means not outsourcing your decisions, not hiding behind ready-made answers or rigid structures. Sartre invites each of us to step into the role of creator of ourselves, creator of values, creator of what it means to be human. And that takes courage. It takes clarity. It takes a real commitment to the truth of your own existence. In Existentialism Is a Humanism, he writes, when we say that man chooses himself, we mean that each of us chooses himself, but in doing so, also chooses all of mankind. It's a powerful, transformative statement. It calls us to a new kind of ethics, one with no absolute rules, but also no excuses. An ethics built on the idea of humanity as a possibility, not a fixed nature. And here's the key. This isn't moralism. Sartre isn't saying we have to be perfect examples. He's saying that when we act, we can't ignore the fact that we're saying something about the human condition. There's no such thing as neutrality. Every act is a statement. Every silence, a choice. Every omission, a responsibility. That may sound like a burden, and it is, but it's also deeply liberating. Because when we take that responsibility seriously, we stop being victims of fate or culture. We become real agents of our existence. And more than that, we actively contribute to the symbolic construction of the world. What you do matters. How you live says something. The kind of human you choose to be is a living proposal for what humanity can become. That's why, for Sartre, individual responsibility isn't just a matter of personal ethics. It's the core of our existence. It's the recognition that in every single action, we're deciding what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of human beings we want to be. Have you ever felt that sudden discomfort when you realize someone was watching you? As if something inside you had been pulled out and put on display. As if, in that instant, you stopped being just the subject of your own experience and became an object in someone else's world. Jean-Paul Sartre dives deep into this feeling and finds one of the most unsettling truths of human experience: intersubjectivity. For Sartre, our relationship with others isn't naturally peaceful or harmonious. On the contrary, it's tense, complex, and often filled with conflict. Why? Because the other person, by simply existing, limits my freedom, just as I limit theirs. And here lies the central dilemma. We are radically free beings, but we don't live alone. We live in a world filled with other consciousnesses that are just as free as we are. And these other minds don't just exist. They see us, judge us, interpret us. And by doing that, they change us. One of Sartre's most famous examples comes from Being and Nothingness. It starts out simply: imagine someone peeking through a keyhole. They're totally absorbed in what they're seeing. Their consciousness is turned outward, fully engaged, free, and unaware of itself. But then, they hear footsteps. Someone's coming. Suddenly, they feel seen, and everything changes. They're no longer just a subject in action. Now they feel themselves as an object in someone else's gaze. This shift is powerful. That person now feels caught, exposed. Not because they've done something morally wrong, but because they've been reduced to an image, a thing in the eyes of another free being. The other person's gaze pulls us out of ourselves and throws us into the world as something external, frozen, limited. In that moment, we feel alienated. Sartre writes, "The gaze of the other fixes me as a thing. That means that the moment I'm seen, I'm no longer pure freedom. I've been perceived, interpreted, labeled. I become that guy, the quiet one, the arrogant one, the pretty one, the failure. It doesn't matter if the label is fair or not. Just being seen exposes me to an identity I can't fully control. I've been reduced to an image in someone else's world. But here's what's even more disturbing. I start to see myself through their eyes. Their gaze creeps into my own self-image. I begin to doubt who I am. I try to match it. I try to reject it. I try to please or resist. But in all these cases, my relationship with myself changes. Intersubjectivity isn't just a philosophical concept. It's an everyday experience. It's in the mirror. It's on social media. It's in every moment when we try to prove ourselves, to be accepted, to protect or hide who we are. Sartre isn't saying that other people are our enemies, but he's showing us something essential. We're not the sole owners of our identity. We are also who we appear to be in the eyes of others. And that part of us is out of our hands. This is one of the great human tragedies, that we can never be completely free subjects. We're always being watched, judged, interpreted. And that puts us in constant tension between freedom and objectification. This tension has no easy solution, because we want to be recognized, but we also want to protect our freedom. We want to be seen, but not labeled. We want connection, but not at the cost of losing ourselves. And often this back and forth turns into a struggle. We try to control how we're perceived. We try to manage the other person's gaze, and at the same time, they're doing the exact same thing to us. Sartre saw this conflict as unavoidable. Our relationship with others is always ambiguous. We want to be loved, understood, validated, but we also want to be free, self-defined, and those desires don't always go together. That's why Sartre famously said, "Hell is other people." Not because people are cruel, but because their very presence reveals the gap between who we are to ourselves and who we are to them. But intersubjectivity isn't just a burden, it also reveals something profound. We are not islands. To live is, inevitably, to relate. Yes, we are freedom, but a freedom that exists in the world of others. And that demands awareness, ethics, and responsibility. If I can see the other as an object, they can do the same to me. If I can invade with my gaze, I can also welcome, listen, and make space. Intersubjectivity can be oppressive, but it can also be the ground for something greater, mutual recognition. When two consciousnesses meet, not as things staring at each other, but as freedoms that respect each other, something new becomes possible, authentic coexistence. But to reach that, we have to let go of the need to control. We have to accept that the other is a mystery, just like ourselves, that we'll never fully control how we're seen, and that's okay. That the other's freedom doesn't cancel ours, it challenges us to grow. Intersubjectivity, with all its pain, is also an invitation to existential maturity. Sartre doesn't give us a neat solution. He offers us a mirror, and in that mirror, we see that being seen is an unavoidable part of living in a shared world. But it's also a chance to reflect on who we are, who we pretend to be, and who we still might become. Few phrases in modern philosophy have caused as much impact as this one. Hell is other people, spoken by Jean-Paul Sartre in his play No Exit, Huis Clos. The line has been widely misunderstood, misquoted, and taken out of context. Many took it as a rejection of others, a call for radical individualism. But Sartre didn't hate other people. He simply understood them deeply and recognized the power they hold over us. This line comes from a suffocating setting. The entire play takes place in one room, a closed space with no mirrors, no windows, no distractions. Three characters, Garcin, Inès, and Estelle, find themselves trapped together, gradually realizing they are dead. They expect physical torture, the classic fire and brimstone version of hell. But none of that happens. There's no fire, no demons, just each other, and it's in this forced, endless coexistence, this constant mirroring, that they face a terrible truth. Eternal punishment doesn't come from screams, but from the gaze of the other. Hell is in the eyes of the other person. Sartre isn't telling us we should live in isolation or avoid human connection. What he's revealing is a deeper existential truth. Our freedom is constantly threatened by the way we're seen by others. The other sees me, interprets me, judges me, and by doing that, turns me into an object. I'm no longer just who I am inside. I become what appears in someone else's world. I lose ownership of my own image. And that's a terrifying feeling. Because while I am a being for itself, consciousness, freedom, potential, the other reduces me to a being in itself, something that can be described, evaluated, labeled. The gaze of the other captures me, and it's almost impossible not to be affected. If someone calls me a coward, even if I know I'm not, the word can haunt me. I may try to prove them wrong, and in doing so, I end up trapped by the very label I wanted to escape. The other's presence has the power to lock me inside myself. That's exactly what we see in the play. Garcin wants to be seen as courageous. He ran away from war but tries to convince himself, and the others, that it was out of principle, not fear. Estelle wants to be adored, desired, beautiful. Inès wants to emotionally dominate the others with her cold clarity. None of them can see themselves directly. They need the gaze of the other to feel real. But that gaze never gives them what they want. They're trapped because their identities depend, tragically, on a reflection they can't control. This constant push and pull between freedom and being trapped is what makes hell real. Not a mystical hell, but an existential one. A state where we're always trying to control how we're seen, but that image slips away. We try to be seen as free, but we're judged as fixed. We try to be understood, but we're misread. We try to be subjects, but we're turned into objects. So hell isn't other people just because they exist. It's because when they see us, they freeze us. And the most disturbing part? We do the exact same thing to them. We also judge, label, reduce. We turn them into what we want them to be. Hell is mutual. No one is just a victim. Everyone plays a part in the prison. But Sartre doesn't stop there. The play isn't just a warning. It's a mirror, a call to awareness. Because hell only begins when we give up our freedom in exchange for the desire to be defined by someone else's gaze. That's the moment we get lost. When we need to be accepted at all costs, loved without resistance, respected without being questioned. When we make the other person the ultimate judge of our identity, that's when the real torture begins. The way out, if there is one, starts with recognizing this game, with realizing that yes, we live under the gaze of others, but we are not only what others see in us. We are more. We are the inner silence, the intention behind the gesture, the desire that hasn't come true yet, the doubt that was never spoken. We are freedom, even when we're being watched. And in that awareness, we begin to regain a part of ourselves. Hell is other people. When we let them decide who we are, when we hand them the power to define our worth, our place, our meaning. But the other person can also be an honest mirror, a necessary boundary, an invitation to authenticity. When we stop seeking only approval and instead seek real connection. When we accept that the other is also a free being, not just a mirror for our ego. Sartre does warn us about the dangers of human relationships. But he also shows us that even in this minefield, we still have freedom. Intersubjectivity isn't the end of freedom. It's its hardest test. Living among others isn't easy, but it's not impossible. It takes courage. It takes self-awareness. It takes the maturity to know that no one will ever fully see all of who we are, and that's okay. Hell is other people, yes, but only when we forget we're still free. Even when we're seen, we can still choose. Even when we're judged, we can still act. Even when we're misunderstood, we can still reinvent ourselves. And maybe that's the key to escaping existential damnation. Not trying to control how others see us, but choosing, boldly, how we see ourselves. No one is born ready. No one comes into the world with a fixed essence, a set path, or a mission engraved on their soul. For Jean-Paul Sartre, every human being is a work in progress, or more precisely, a project of being. We are not just what we do, we are what we choose to do with what we are. And that choice, even when quiet and made in everyday moments, is the foundation of what Sartre calls our existential project. But what exactly does that mean? When Sartre talks about an existential project, he's referring to the way each person, through their radical freedom, chooses a way of being in the world. This choice isn't always conscious at first. It often happens without us realizing it, but it's real, concrete, and deep. It's the direction we give to our lives. It's the invisible thread that holds together our actions, desires, and justifications. The existential project is the backdrop of our existence. What gives coherence to our choices, even when they seem contradictory? For example, someone might build their existential project around seeking social recognition. Their whole life, from career choices to friendships to subtle behaviors, may revolve around wanting to be seen, valued, admired. Another person might choose personal freedom as their core and make decisions that avoid attachments, dependencies, or long-term commitments. A third might focus on safety and stability, always trying to minimize risk and avoid major disruptions. In each case, there's a chosen way of being, even if it's unconscious. It's a life project. Sartre's bold shift is in saying that we are not victims of these projects. We are their authors. Even when life seems to have pushed us into a specific role, we said yes to it at some point. This doesn't mean Sartre denies social, historical, or psychological conditioning. He's not naive, but he insists, within those limits, freedom still exists, and it's within that space that our project takes shape. We are what we choose to do with what life has done to us. This leads to a powerful and uncomfortable conclusion. There are no excuses. We can't say, I'm like this because life made me this way. Life puts us in certain situations. Yes, but we choose how to respond to them. The existential project is that ongoing response, renewed with every action. That's why Sartre says human beings are freedom, because we are always relating to the future, always projecting ourselves, always reaching beyond. We are not fixed beings, we are becomings. And this existential project also carries an ethical dimension. It's not just a personal choice. When I decide on a way of being, I'm implicitly saying that this way is valid, that it's a legitimate expression of what it means to be human. Sartre says, in choosing for myself, I choose for all. That means my life is also a proposal to others, a quiet statement. This way of being human is possible. And that's why, for Sartre, freedom always comes with responsibility. But the project is not permanent. Sartre rejects any idea of fate or a fixed essence. The existential project can, and should, be questioned, revised, transformed. True authenticity lies in exactly that. The ability to look at yourself and realize when you're living a project that's not really yours. When you're just fulfilling expectations, repeating roles, or performing out of habit. That's bad faith. It's pretending we're not free. Authenticity, on the other hand, is taking ownership of your life. It's becoming aware of your project and, if necessary, rewriting it. And that takes courage. Because changing an existential project is like switching train tracks while the train is still moving. It might mean breaking things, letting go, starting over, but it's also an act of strength, maturity, and reinvention. And Sartre reminds us, there's always a choice. There's always room for a turning point. It doesn't matter how long you've been living someone else's project. Your freedom is still there. Maybe it's buried, asleep, forgotten, but it's there, waiting for a moment of clarity. The existential project also brings a deep sense of meaning, not a meaning given from outside, like a mission assigned to you, but a meaning built from within. Life doesn't come with a pre-packaged purpose, but it can have meaning. A meaning you create through your actions, your choices, your commitment to a way of being that feels real to you. And that, for Sartre, is what saves us from the void. There's no essence, no God, no eternal values, but there is action, there is freedom, there is creation. And the existential project is where it all comes together. So maybe the most important question isn't who am I, but who am I choosing to be right now? And more than that, is this project I'm living really mine, or am I just playing a role? These aren't questions with easy answers, and they're not supposed to be. But they're the beginning of a conscious life. Because at the end of the day, to live is to choose a project and back it up with real action. Sartre invites us to let go of the idea of a true self hidden somewhere inside, waiting to be discovered. For him, there is no essence to uncover, there is a project to build, and that changes everything. We're not here to be loyal to some inner blueprint. We're here to invent, through freedom, a life that makes sense, a life that is ours, even if messy, flawed, or incomplete. A life where, at the very least, we can say with honesty, I chose this. The classic image of the philosopher isolated in an ivory tower, contemplating eternal truths while the world burns outside, has no place in Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy. For him, thinking is a form of action, and any thought that turns away from the world is, at its core, a form of omission. There's no such thing as neutrality. There's no such thing as pure philosophy. In the face of pain, injustice, and oppression, silence is a choice, and every choice carries political weight. Sartre believed that for human freedom to be real, it couldn't just be an internal, individual thing. To be free, also means to take part in history, to get involved with the present, to take responsibility for what's happening around us. That's why he completely rejects the idea of a philosopher who stands apart from reality. For Sartre, philosophy only matters when it's covered in the dirt of the world, when it risks conflict with reality, when it challenges the social, economic, and political systems that shape, and often imprison, human lives. This stance started taking shape in the 1940s, but it grew stronger after the war. Sartre had lived through the horrors of the Nazi occupation, the violence of war, the weight of cowardice, and the value of resistance. That shaped his sense of responsibility. Freedom wasn't just a nice idea, it was a duty. If you're free, you must act. If you're aware, you must engage. This belief came through not only in his writing, but in his public life. Sartre didn't just write about freedom, he lived it by committing himself to the causes of his time. He defied censorship, protested the Algerian War, opposed the Vietnam War, criticized the abuses of capitalism, and also the crimes committed in the name of communism. He stood with workers, students, colonized people, and political dissidents, not because he always agreed with them, but because he refused to be indifferent. For Sartre, every person is situated, meaning we all live within a specific social and historical context, and every choice we make, even silence or neutrality, is a position. Even saying, "I don't want to get involved in politics," is a political choice. It's a decision to let things stay the way they are. There's no escaping it. As Sartre wrote, man is condemned to be free, and that includes the collective level too. Freedom demands that we take a stand. That's why Sartre fiercely criticized the idea of philosophy being neutral, objective, or above human struggle. To him, any philosophy that doesn't commit to changing the world ends up helping to keep things exactly as they are. Thinking without acting is a luxury for those who can afford to ignore the pain of others. And in Sartre's view, a philosopher has an ethical duty to use their clarity to open new paths, expose injustice, and create possibilities for freedom. But that engagement doesn't mean blind commitment. Sartre didn't believe that a philosopher should become a party loyalist or a dogmatic activist. In fact, his relationship with politics was always critical, complex, and full of tension. Many times, he broke alliances, called out contradictions, and rethought his own views. Because real engagement isn't blind faith, it's constant awareness. It's not about repeating slogans, but about keeping your mind active, ethical, and awake. The engaged philosopher is the one who refuses to get too comfortable, either in power or in fixed ideas. Sartre was one of the first to clearly see that political structures shape how we see ourselves. They influence how we think, feel, and understand our place in the world. That means freedom is never just individual. A person is only truly free when the social conditions around them allow it. That's why, for Sartre, fighting oppression is inseparable from the philosophy of freedom. It's not enough to say, we're free. We have to fight to make freedom real for everyone. In this sense, he aligned with thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Simone de Beauvoir, who also believed that human existence is shaped by circumstance, and that true liberation requires deep structural change. Sartre openly recognized racism as a systemic form of violence that dehumanizes others, and he understood that the fight against racism, colonialism, misogyny, or economic exploitation isn't outside philosophy. It's the very ground of existential ethics. And yes, Sartre paid the price for this stance. He was criticized, targeted, and censored, but he never backed down. In 1964, he even refused the Nobel Prize in Literature. For him, accepting an official award from a system he opposed would be a betrayal of his freedom and of his role as a committed intellectual. That refusal wasn't just symbolic, it was a reminder that the true measure of a philosopher is the alignment between thought and action. For Sartre, political engagement isn't some extra feature of life, it's a natural consequence of existence. To think is to transform. To reflect is to take responsibility, and to act is an ethical obligation. We live in a world where individual choices echo into the collective. Every word, every silence, every position we take helps shape or destroy the way we live together. In that context, sitting on the fence isn't neutral, it's complicity. That's why existentialist philosophy is, at its core, a philosophy of engagement. You can't talk about freedom without talking about justice. You can't think about human beings without considering the conditions they live in. And you can't pursue authenticity without also wanting real change. So Sartre invites us to think with our feet on the ground, to get our hands dirty if we have to leave behind the safety of abstraction and dive into the messiness of real life. Because in the end, it's not enough to think about freedom. We have to fight for it. For many, the absence of God feels like a void, an abyss, a loss of meaning, a cold, directionless world. But for Jean-Paul Sartre, that emptiness is, paradoxically, the space where human freedom can finally flourish. Existentialist atheism, for him, isn't just about denying the existence of God. It's a radical affirmation of human autonomy. If God doesn't exist, then we, and only we, are responsible for giving meaning to our existence. This idea isn't born out of petty rebellion or hopeless nihilism. It's a logical consequence of existentialist philosophy. Sartre starts from the belief that existence precedes essence. In other words, human beings exist first, and only later define who they are through their choices. But behind that statement lies a theological backdrop that must be rejected for freedom to be fully real. And that backdrop is the idea of God as creator and moral lawgiver. For centuries, Western philosophy was built on the belief that God was the foundation of being, morality, and meaning. God created humans with a purpose. Morality came from above. Meaning was given, not chosen. We existed with a destiny. Sartre flips this logic. If there's no creator, then there's no human blueprint to follow, no human essence written by a higher will. We are thrown into the world, alone, free, without a script. And that's where everything begins. Sartre doesn't deny that God's absence is unsettling. On the contrary, he takes it very seriously. Without God, there are no objective notions of good or evil, no fixed human nature, no absolute guidance, no metaphysical guarantees. We are completely on our own. And it's precisely in that emptiness, that cosmic silence, that the deepest kind of freedom emerges. The freedom to create values, to build meaning, to choose ourselves as a life project. Man doesn't just exist, he invents himself. In his famous essay, Existentialism Is a Humanism, Sartre responds to critics who accused existentialism of being a philosophy of despair. After all, if there's no God, no given values, no destiny, doesn't that mean everything is meaningless? That anything goes? That life is worthless? Sartre answers firmly, no. The absence of God isn't the end of meaning, it's the beginning. We are the ones who must create the values that guide our choices. And this creation is not random. It comes with responsibility. Because when we choose, we're not just choosing for ourselves, but for all of humanity. That's the core of existentialist ethics. If God doesn't exist, then it's up to us to become the lawgivers. Every action, every choice, every decision is an act of meaning-making. When I choose to live with honesty, I'm declaring that honesty is valuable. When I choose to lie, cheat, or hide, I'm also embracing that way of being as possible. There are no longer divine commandments, but there is the full weight of human freedom and universal responsibility. Morality isn't abandoned, it's redefined. In that sense, existentialist atheism is both liberating and demanding. It frees us from divine authority, from blind obedience, from hope in a future salvation. But in return, it asks for maturity, courage, and clarity. There's no one to hide behind, no one to delegate to. no final judgment. There is only life, here and now, and the need to give it meaning, not in theory, but in practice, through every choice we make. Sartre knows this view is uncomfortable. Many people prefer a world with guarantees. They prefer a God who tells them what's right and wrong, who offers comfort, who gives meaning to suffering. But he insists that's bad faith. It's an attempt to escape freedom by handing off responsibility to a higher power. It's more comfortable to believe in a divine plan than to accept that we are the ones who create meaning. And this isn't about proving God doesn't exist. Sartre doesn't turn his philosophy into militant atheism like some modern thinkers do. He simply starts from the assumption that God doesn't exist as the necessary condition for radical freedom. If God did exist, human essence would be predetermined. Values would come ready-made. Choices would just be part of fulfilling a mission, not real expressions of freedom. But without God, the human being becomes absolutely free and absolutely responsible. This vision also transforms our relationship with death. Without a promise of eternity, life takes on a deep sense of urgency. Every moment matters. Every decision carries unique weight. There's no afterlife to justify waiting or suffering. There's only this life, this world, this body, and far from making life feel meaningless, that makes it even more precious. Every gesture, no matter how small, becomes an act of meaning. Sartre isn't asking us to live without faith. He's asking us to live with authenticity. To recognize that the search for a savior God is often just a way to avoid the responsibility of being free. And if we have the courage to accept that freedom, we can build a life that is truly our own, not inherited, not imposed, but chosen. Existentialist atheism is, in that way, a call to spiritual maturity, an invitation to leave behind easy promises and embrace the hard beauty of an existence without guarantees, an existence where meaning isn't handed to us, but can be created through action, through choice, through responsibility, through freedom. Sartre tells us clearly, man is what he makes of himself, and for him, that's more powerful than any external salvation, because it doesn't depend on a world beyond, it depends only on us. In a world where so many people are searching for absolute answers, fixed rules, and definitive truths about what's right and wrong, Jean-Paul Sartre presents an unsettling and deeply liberating idea. There are no objective moral values, no eternal moral code that applies to all times, all people, and all situations. No commandments written in the stars. For Sartre, morality is born out of choice, and each choice is, at the same time, the creation of a value. At first glance, this idea might seem dangerous. After all, if there are no universal values, what's to stop anyone from doing whatever they want? What protects us from chaos, selfishness, or violence? But Sartre isn't promoting shallow relativism or careless individualism. His proposal goes much deeper and demands much more. Because if there are no given values, then we are the ones who must create them, uphold them, and answer for them through our concrete actions. This critique of universal morality comes straight from the core of existentialist philosophy, the radical freedom of the human being. If there's no human essence that comes before existence, if we're thrown into the world and only then define ourselves, then there can't be any ready-made morality waiting to be followed. Values don't exist outside of us. They exist in our decisions. Sartre breaks away from two major philosophical traditions in morality, both religious morality, based on divine commandments, and rationalist morality, like that of Immanuel Kant, which seeks universal principles rooted in pure reason. For Sartre, both approaches ignore the real condition of human existence, the fact that we are always situated. We don't live in an abstract world. We live here now, within historical, social, political, and emotional circumstances. And it's within this context that we're called to act. Ethics, then, isn't the application of eternal principles to real-life situations. It's a unique invention, born in the heat of the moment. When you act, you're not just following a value, you're saying that the value is worth following. You're putting something into the world with your body and your actions that says what you believe is good, just, and meaningful. Sartre writes, "By choosing for myself, I choose for all of humanity." That line is key to understanding his critique of universal morality. It means that when I make a choice, I'm not just deciding who I am. I'm expressing a vision of what it means to be human. I'm saying, through my actions, that this is a valid way to exist in the world. I'm not neutral. Every gesture is a statement. Every silence, a position. Every ethical decision is a symbolic creation that reaches beyond me. That's why existentialism doesn't erase morality. It deepens our responsibility. It doesn't say anything goes in a careless sense, but rather that there are no excuses. If there's no universal moral law to hide behind, then every choice demands reflection, awareness, and accountability. Existentialist ethics isn't light. It's a burden that can only be carried by those who accept their own freedom. Sartre insists, the situation never justifies. We may face real dilemmas, difficult contexts, external pressures. But even then, we're the ones who choose how to respond. And that choice is ethical, because it doesn't just solve an immediate problem. It creates a path, a sense of coherence, a value that echoes into the world. In Existentialism Is a Humanism, Sartre tells the story of a young Frenchman during World War II. This young man faces a moral dilemma. Should he stay home and care for his aging, lonely mother, or leave and join the resistance against the Nazis? He looks for guidance, Christian morality, patriotic duty, universal reason. None of them offer a clear answer. They all conflict. Sartre's conclusion: there's no formula that can decide. It's up to him, and only him, to choose. And that choice, made in the absence of ready-made rules, will be an act of freedom and of value creation. But this isn't just a war story, it's about us. Every day, we face choices that no handbook can solve, choices that don't fit into universal rules. How do you stand up to injustice at work? How do you deal with an unclear relationship? How do you balance being honest with not hurting someone? There's no exact rule for any of these. There's only you, your freedom, and your responsibility. Universal morality seeks safety. Sartre offers clarity. He invites us to let go of the illusion that there's always a ready answer, to recognize that ethics isn't a set of rules imposed from above, but a living process, grounded in experience, shaped by risk, and sustained by authenticity. But this freedom doesn't isolate us. On the contrary, it connects us even more to others. Because when we create values through our choices, we are contributing to the symbolic construction of the world. We are speaking to others, even if we don't realize it. We're saying, it's possible to live like this, and that makes us not only authors of ourselves, but co-authors of humanity. So criticizing universal morality doesn't mean destroying ethics. It means giving ethics its rightful place in real life, in concrete choices, in the heart of someone brave enough to live. Sartre doesn't offer us certainties, but he gives us something more valuable: the chance to create meaning where there was only silence. There are no ready-made values, but there is a real, urgent, and non-transferable chance to choose with responsibility, and in that choice, to bring values into existence. There's a quiet, almost imperceptible moment when something inside us shifts. We're alone in a room, acting naturally, moving without thinking, until we realize someone is watching. And then, almost like a reflex, our body stiffens, our posture adjusts, and our awareness turns outward. Suddenly, we're no longer just ourselves. We become whatever appears in the other person's gaze. That's the moment when, as Sartre puts it, we become a being for others. We. This concept, explored in depth in his work Being and Nothingness, reveals one of the most delicate aspects of human existence, the awareness of how we are seen, interpreted, and judged by others. It's not just about worrying what people think, it's something deeper, something structural. Sartre shows that the other isn't just someone we interact with. The other is the one who reflects us back to ourselves as an image, as an object in the world. When I'm alone, I experience myself as free, as a work in progress, as an open-ended project I keep creating through my choices. But the moment I realize I'm being watched, something freezes. I'm thrown outside of myself. I'm returned to myself as a he or she, as someone who can be described, judged, labeled. Sartre illustrates this with a simple but powerful scene. Someone peeking through a keyhole. While they're alone, they're lost in the act, absorbed in their curiosity, unaware of themselves. But the second they hear footsteps, the moment they suspect they're being watched, everything changes. They now see themselves as someone spying, as someone suspicious, as an object under someone else's gaze. In that instant, they become both for themselves and for others. But the for others takes over. Their experience is captured, interrupted, transformed. This gaze isn't just physical, it's symbolic. It's the gaze of society, of culture, of institutions. It's the gaze that turns us into the one who's always late, the girl who dresses like that, the quiet one, the single mum, the poor guy, the weirdo, the successful one. These are images we don't control, but they reach us, and often they hurt, because they reduce us, they turn us into things. Sartre says that, in that moment, we become an object for a consciousness. And that hurts, because we are not just what we do, we are what we long to become, what we're still striving to be. But the other person's gaze interrupts that. They don't see our inner process, they see only the surface. And by looking at us, they pin us down into a definition we can't control. This is an unavoidable part of life in society. We live among others. We see ourselves through others. And in a way, we need others to know ourselves. But this comes at a price. We lose full sovereignty over who we are. We'll never be only subjects. We'll always also be objects in someone else's mind. That creates a permanent tension. We want to be recognized, understood, loved. But we also want to be free, undefined, uncontainable. We want to be seen, but not reduced. We want to connect, but not be trapped in labels. This conflict is at the heart of Sartre's view of human relationships, and it's also one of the roots of bad faith. When we start living only as others see us, trying to fit in, to please, to avoid judgment, we deny our freedom, our fluidity, our living humanity. But there's another side to this. Just as we suffer from being seen as objects by others, we also do the same to them. We gaze, we label, we interpret. We project our fears, our fantasies, our expectations. We thingify others too, often without noticing. And this constant back and forth between subjects who turn each other into objects is what makes human relationships so intense, so difficult, and paradoxically, so necessary. For Sartre, being for others is not something we can avoid. It's part of what it means to exist. There's no escaping the gaze. The real question is, what do we do with it? Do we let it define us completely? Do we live only for the image we create in someone else's eyes? Or do we acknowledge it and still hold on to our freedom? Sartre's answer lies in authenticity. Yes, we are seen, but we don't have to be trapped by it. We can accept that being human means also being an image for others, but never reducing ourselves to that image. We can live among others without losing ourselves in them. We can hold the tension between the desire to be recognized and the need to remain a free, choosing being. In everyday life, this means resisting the urge to fit in just to be accepted. It means not living for applause or out of fear. It means knowing that you will be judged, often misunderstood, But that doesn't define you. You are still the one who can say no, start over, break free, rebuild. The image others have of you does not exhaust who you are. Sartre doesn't offer easy comfort. He simply lays bare the human condition with honesty and clarity. Being seen is inevitable. Being an object in someone else's gaze is painful, but freedom still remains. Even when we're being watched, we are more than what the gaze sees. We are still consciousness. We are still movement. We can still choose. Being for others reminds us that living with others is always a risk, but also a possibility. We can get lost in the images projected onto us, or we can use them to transform ourselves. We can be defined, or we can defy definition day after day, because in the end, no matter what, we are still free. For Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom isn't some abstract idea or a pass to do whatever you want. It's real, concrete, and demanding. Yes, it's the foundation of human existence, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Freedom is born and lived within a context, within a situation. Sartre urges us to understand that while we are radically free, our freedom is always situated. What does that mean? It means no one chooses where or when they're born. We don't choose our bodies, our social background, the language we speak, or the historical moment we live in. We don't choose the economy we're born into, the political systems, or our family traumas. We're thrown into the world, as Sartre would say, and it's within this world that we must invent ourselves. But that doesn't make us puppets. On the contrary, it's precisely because we're situated that freedom becomes something real. It's not the freedom of a god or a pure spirit floating above reality. It's human freedom, which has to deal with limits, circumstances, and the facts of life. And still, or maybe because of all that, we are free to choose what to do with what happens to us. This idea is key to pushing back against the distorted view that Sartre believed in some kind of unlimited or absolute freedom. Critics often confuse the radical freedom he defended with a fantasy of being all-powerful. But that's not what he meant. Sartre's freedom is radical because it's unavoidable. Because in every situation, no matter how oppressive, we still have the power to say yes or no, to accept or resist, to commit or to refuse. But it's also situated because it never happens outside of the world, outside the body, or outside of history. One of the strongest examples of this situated freedom is Sartre's own life. During the Nazi occupation of France, he could have chosen to stay silent, to play it safe, to keep his intellectual life far away from the war. But instead, he chose to speak out, to write, and to take part in the resistance. He was in a concrete situation of danger, fear, and limitation, and it was within that reality that his freedom was expressed. And it's no different for us. Everyone lives in a specific reality. A single mother working 2 jobs with barely any free time, a young black man from the outskirts facing institutional violence, a sick elderly person, an undocumented immigrant. They all live under the pressure of external forces. But that doesn't mean they're entirely trapped. There's still freedom. There are still choices. There is still responsibility. Not in theory, but as situated action, with its own limits and possibilities. Sartre doesn't romanticize this condition. He knows the world is unfair, that systems of oppression exist, that not everyone has the same opportunities, and precisely because of that, his philosophy insists on freedom as a response. Because if we're not free to respond to the world, then all that's left is conformity, resignation, and passivity. And that, for Sartre, is the deepest denial of human existence. Situated freedom also comes with ethical weight. If we are free inside a shared world, then our choices affect others, and we need to consider the consequences. It's not enough to do what feels good for ourselves. We have to think about how our actions shape the world. Freedom only becomes whole when we recognize it as part of a network of relationships, conflicts, and structures. And in that awareness, responsibility is born. To live with situated freedom, then, is to accept the challenge of being an agent in a world we don't fully control. It's realizing that even when everything seems to be pushing us in one direction, we still have an inner space for decision, a margin of choice. And in that space, authentic existence begins. Think of the people who, even in the harshest conditions, refuse to stay still, who take a stand, who create, who resist. A woman who decides to go back to school at 60, a former inmate who chooses to rebuild his dignity, a young man who walks away from violence even though he's surrounded by it. These acts aren't magic. They don't erase how heavy the circumstances are, but they are expressions of a freedom that refused to give in. Of course, not every choice is big or heroic. Most of our decisions happen in the small details of life: how we speak to someone, what we consume, what we tolerate, what we ignore. But it's exactly these small acts that, over time, show how we're using our freedom inside our situation. Sartre challenges us to take on this role with clarity, not to deny the world's limits, but to stop using them as excuses. Because so often, we hide behind the idea that we have no choice, just to escape the weight of responsibility. But deep down, we know there's always a margin. There's always one possible move. Even when everything feels locked in, the way we respond is still ours. This might be one of Sartre's most powerful ideas. We are not free despite our circumstances. We are free within them. And that kind of freedom, situated, grounded, embodied, is the kind that actually changes the world. Not some theoretical, abstract, distant freedom, but a freedom that shows up, takes action, and claims its place in time and space. So, to be free, for Sartre, isn't about having everything in your hands. It's about never giving up on what still can be done. It's about finding, in the middle of the chaos, that small thread of action that still depends on you. It's about saying, even here, even now, I choose. And in that moment, existence becomes real. In a world full of masks, ready-made roles, and imposed expectations, talking about authenticity feels both revolutionary and terrifying. Jean-Paul Sartre takes this word to a deep existential level. To live authentically is to recognize, without illusions, your own freedom, and to courageously take responsibility for everything you are. Authenticity, for Sartre, is not some decorative virtue. It's not about being true to yourself in a superficial or romantic sense. It's not just following your heart or being spontaneous. Living authentically means embracing the human condition in its entirety, everything that comes with it: anxiety, hard choices, the absence of guarantees, and above all, freedom. The starting point lies in the very structure of existence. As we've seen in previous lessons, Sartre says we are not born with a ready-made essence. There is no true self waiting to be discovered. No divine plan, no fixed human nature, no destiny. Human beings exist first, and only afterward define themselves through the choices they make, the commitments they take on, and the actions they carry out. We are what we make of ourselves. But this process of becoming is surrounded by temptations. The most common is to run from freedom, to pretend we don't have a choice, to hide behind roles, rules, and social expectations, to live as if we were just gears in a machine, victims, or mere reflections of what others expect from us. Sartre calls this bad faith, the self-deception that refuses to face the fact that we are, inevitably, free and responsible. Authenticity is the opposite of that. It's the moment when consciousness wakes up and says, yes, I'm free, and this freedom is my responsibility. There's no more room for excuses, for blame shifting, or for saying, I'm this way because they made me this way. The authentic person understands that even in the worst situations, there's still the possibility of choice. Even when everything around you pressures you, the final decision is still yours. Of course, living this way requires strength. Authenticity isn't comfortable. It demands that you stop hiding, that you take off the masks that protect you, that you face the loneliness of freedom. Because once you realize there's no higher structure determining what's right or wrong, good or evil, you also realize there's nothing to lean on. The ground disappears, and what's left is your raw freedom and the need to choose. But it's exactly in that space where existence becomes real. The authentic human being isn't someone who always gets it right, but someone who acts with awareness, who owns their decisions, who doesn't run away from the responsibility of becoming, who doesn't hide in the automatic habits of routine or in the comfort of social norms. It's the person who, even when failing, knows they failed and takes responsibility, who, even when wrong, admits it was their own mistake, not fate's, not someone else's. So authenticity is, above all, a call to lucidity, a rejection of existential anesthesia. It's refusing to live on autopilot. It's realizing that every gesture, every word, every choice is a statement about who you are and about what kind of human being you believe people can be. There is no neutrality. Every act is a message, every silence too. To live authentically is to not run from that truth. Sartre also shows us that authenticity is not isolation. It's not locking yourself inside your own mind. On the contrary, it's recognizing that we live among others and that our choices echo beyond us. The responsibility that comes with authenticity isn't just personal, it's also collective. When I choose a path, I'm saying that path is possible, valid, and desirable. I'm, in a sense, proposing a vision of what humanity can be. And that connects us to the world, to history, to social, political, and cultural structures. Because to be authentic is also to refuse to be complicit in oppression, injustice, and conformity. It's saying, I exist, I'm free. And this freedom will not bow down, not out of arrogance, but out of responsibility. Because accepting the world as it is, when it excludes, oppresses, or silences, is also a form of bad faith. Authenticity then becomes a form of resistance, a political act, a creative gesture. It's what allows us to build a life with meaning, not because meaning comes from outside, but because we choose it, sustain it, and live it. And this meaning is fragile, temporary, subject to change, but it's ours, not inherited, not imposed, not memorized. Chosen, authentic. But it's worth repeating. Being authentic doesn't mean always being right. It means being aware. It means not betraying your freedom. It means being able to look at your life and say, that was my choice, even if it was hard, even if it cost something, even if it didn't turn out the way you hoped. Authenticity is loyalty to yourself, not as some fixed identity, but as a living project. At its core, Sartre invites us to live more truthfully, a life where we don't hide behind excuses or social masks, a life where we fully acknowledge the freedom within us and the weight it brings. And in doing so, he doesn't offer comfort. He offers responsibility, awareness, and power. To live authentically is to refuse to be a spectator of your own life. It's to be the author, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when it exposes you. Because in the end, there's no other real way to exist. In 1945, Jean-Paul Sartre stepped onto the stage at the Salle des Centraux in Paris to deliver a lecture that would forever change how existentialism was understood. In front of a restless audience, shaped by the trauma of a just-ended war and a Europe still struggling to stand, Sartre gave the talk that would later become one of his most famous works. Existentialism is a Humanism. In that text, he responds to criticisms, clears up misunderstandings, and above all, states clearly and firmly, existentialism is not a philosophy of despair. It is a philosophy of freedom and responsibility. This work emerged at a time when existentialism was under attack from all sides. The political right saw it as nihilistic, destructive, and dangerous. The Marxist left accused it of bourgeois idealism, too focused on individual freedom and blind to class struggle. Others claimed Sartre's philosophy led to passivity, relativism, and moral chaos. Sartre faced these criticisms head-on, with rare clarity. Existentialism does not deny the human being. It affirms the human more radically than any philosophy before it. The first major idea he reaffirms is the famous existentialist claim: existence precedes essence. But now, Sartre breaks it down in a more direct and relatable way. He says, if God doesn't exist, then there is no universal human nature, no ideal model to follow. Man is not born with a set purpose. He simply exists, is thrown into the world, and only afterward defines himself, builds himself, and chooses who he is going to be. And this is where humanism comes in. For Sartre, calling existentialism a humanism isn't about saying humans are inherently good, superior, or the center of the universe. It means recognizing that we are fully responsible for ourselves, that nothing outside of us is going to save us, justify us, or define us. We are, in his words, condemned to be free. And that means our dignity lies exactly in our ability to create ourselves. This is a deep revaluation of the human being, not as God's creation, not as a cog in the wheel of history, but as the author of their own existence. We're not here to fulfill some destiny. We're here to write the meaning of our lives with our choices, and that applies to everyone in every situation. Sartre doesn't separate the philosopher from the worker or the poet from the farmer. We are all equally condemned to freedom, and we are all equally responsible for our choices. But this freedom is not light. It's not romantic. Sartre insists that it comes with anxiety, responsibility, and an ethical burden. Because when I choose, I'm not just defining myself, I'm also suggesting a model for humanity. Every decision I make says, this is a valid way to be. That's why our actions carry a commitment to others, to the world. Ethics doesn't come from external commandments. It's born from the heart of freedom. By saying existentialism is a humanism, Sartre also takes on a common belief of the time, that without God, there can be no morality. His answer is firm. It's precisely because God doesn't exist that we are even more responsible. We can't hide behind divine authority or fixed rules anymore. We have to invent our values and live them out. That doesn't lead to chaos, but to authenticity. Not to anarchy, but to commitment. And Sartre makes it clear, that doesn't mean anything goes. Quite the opposite. Everything is a choice, and every choice has consequences. Every decision is an act of affirmation, and that requires courage. Existentialism doesn't hand you easy answers, but it doesn't leave you lost either. It offers a compass, the awareness that we are free, situated, and always in the process of becoming. Philosophy, then, stops being just an abstract exercise and becomes a way of life, a call to action, an invitation to responsibility. Existentialism is a humanism because it sees the human being as a project, as possibility, as continuous creation. There's no true self waiting to be found. There is only a possible self to be built, day by day, choice by choice. And that also means no excuses. Sartre rejects any kind of existential victimhood. Yes, he fully acknowledges that social, historical, and material conditions limit us. But even within those limits, freedom still exists. We may not choose what happens to us, but we do choose how we respond. We are, as he puts it, what we make of what was made of us. By the end of the lecture, Sartre had done more than just defend himself. He had outlined a philosophy that, instead of denying humanity, places it at the very center of responsibility for the world. Existentialism isn't a refuge for selfishness or a path to hopelessness. It's an ethic of action, awareness, and creation. A philosophy that looks the human being in the eye and says, yes, you are alone. And that's exactly why you are free. And being free is the greatest dignity a person can have. Existentialism is a humanism remains to this day one of the most powerful and accessible gateways into Sartre's thought. In it, Existentialism reveals its clearest form, not as a cult of emptiness, but as a call to take responsibility for existing, and to exist in a way that's truly our own. Jean-Paul Sartre never shied away from the big human questions: desire, suffering, trauma, the formation of identity. He saw subjectivity as something dynamic, open, constantly being built, and for that very reason, he couldn't accept the idea that we are governed by unconscious forces beyond our control. His critique of Freudian psychoanalysis isn't just theoretical. It's first and foremost a radical affirmation of human freedom in the face of psychological determinism. Sartre didn't reject psychoanalysis as a whole or its attempt to explore the human soul. On the contrary, he acknowledged its importance in the effort to understand human beings on a deeper level. But he proposed a different kind of psychoanalysis, one that breaks free from the idea that we're prisoners of unconscious impulses or rigid psychological structures. This new approach, which he called existential psychoanalysis, is built on a core, non-negotiable principle of existentialism. The human being is freedom. For Freud, our inner lives are ruled by forces that operate below the level of consciousness: drives, repressions, childhood traumas. There's an internal logic to the unconscious that shapes our behavior, even if we're unaware of it. In that view, a person is largely a product of their past, their complexes, and internal censorship. Sartre, however, saw a danger in this: the risk of turning human beings into mere objects. To him, traditional psychoanalysis runs the risk of making us less responsible for our actions. If our behavior is determined by unconscious desires we never chose, then how can we be held accountable? How can we talk about freedom, about personal projects, about authenticity? How can we change if we're just the product of hidden mechanisms? Sartre's answer is clear. The unconscious, as Freud described it, doesn't exist, at least not as some separate entity acting independently of our awareness. Instead, what we often call the unconscious are actually strategies of bad faith, ways we use to avoid facing our freedom, to hide from ourselves, to escape the anxiety that comes from having to own our choices. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre wrote, "If man is free, then there's no need for an unconscious." That doesn't mean he believed all our actions are fully conscious all the time, or that internal conflict doesn't exist. But for him, these conflicts don't come from pre-existing psychic structures. They arise from our choices, even if those choices are hidden, denied, or disguised. Even when someone deceives themselves, they are still the author of that deception. So Sartre proposes an existential psychoanalysis centered around a key question: what is this person's project of being? In other words, rather than digging into a repressed past to find the origin of someone's suffering, he invites us to look at the present and the future. What kind of person is this individual trying to become? What values are they trying to assert or avoid? What kind of life are they attempting to build? And where are they getting lost in the contradictions of that path? The idea of a project is crucial here. For Sartre, every behavior has meaning, even the most self-destructive ones. Lying, cowardice, addiction, repeating the same mistakes. All of it can be understood if we examine the kind of existence someone is trying to construct. Not by looking for causes in the past, but by understanding a deeper movement of freedom. A personal project that's often silent, unconscious in a weak sense, but never determined. Always chosen. This view demands a more active perspective on the individual. The person is no longer seen as an object to be decoded by an expert. They are called to responsibility. Existential psychoanalysis, then, doesn't interpret for the patient. It invites the patient to interpret themselves. It doesn't offer rigid explanations. It offers freedom, and with it, anxiety, but also the possibility of change. This model has clinical implications, but also deep philosophical ones. It changes the way we see human suffering. Not as something to be cured with techniques, but as a symptom of a life at war with itself. The task, then, is not to eliminate the conflict. but to bring it to light so the person can make more honest choices about who they want to become. And that applies to what we often call personality, too. Sartre believed there is no fixed self, no unchanging identity. There's a collection of habits, tendencies, and repeated choices, all of which can be undone. He wrote, "Character is not an excuse. It's an invention of the person themselves." In other words, even the parts of us that seem most deep and essential are actually built through choices. Of course, this view takes immense courage, because if we can't blame the unconscious or fate or our childhood anymore, then we're left with only freedom. And with it, risk, anxiety, and total responsibility. But also, the real possibility of change, of transformation, of starting over. Sartre didn't deny the complexity of the human mind, but he refused to see it as a machine. He saw it as freedom in motion, a project unfolding through time, a field of choices, ambiguities, contradictions, but always in the end, a matter of responsibility. His critique of Freudian psychoanalysis is not a rejection. It's an opening, an invitation to see human beings not as victims of what they've been through, but as authors of what's still to come. A philosophy of freedom that even in the face of suffering, never gives up on the power of choice, never gives up on humanity. For Jean-Paul Sartre, writing wasn't just an intellectual activity. It was an existential act, an ethical and political gesture. More than anything, it was an exercise of freedom aimed at the freedom of others. His literary work wasn't separate from his philosophy. On the contrary, it's where his philosophy lives, takes shape, becomes visible, dramatic, and alive. Sartre believed that literature is action. That's why he chose novels, theatre, and essays as legitimate, and even privileged, ways to express his ideas. Unlike many traditional philosophers who write only in technical or academic language, Sartre understood that human existence isn't limited to abstract concepts. Life happens in conflict, ambiguity, and real choices. And that's exactly where literature hits hardest. It makes us feel the weight of decisions, the anxiety of freedom, the pain of responsibility, the complexity of being in the world. For Sartre, literature isn't here to simply entertain. It's here to reveal, to provoke, to transform. From early on, Sartre used fiction as an existential laboratory. In novels like Nausea and The Roads to Freedom, he doesn't explain his philosophy. He brings it to life. The reader doesn't find a treatise on freedom, but real characters trying to deal with it. You won't find textbook definitions of bad faith, but instead lives shaped by self-deception, cowardice, and late-coming lucidity. Philosophy is there, torn and bleeding in the lives of his characters. In Nausea, for example, the protagonist Antoine Roquentin experiences a deep discomfort with the world. He feels like objects, things, even his own body, have lost any inherent meaning. Everything feels absurd, random, and empty of essence. That sensation, which he calls nausea, is a concrete manifestation of the central idea of existentialism. There is no given meaning. Human beings are thrown into a world with no guarantees, and it's up to each of us to invent the meaning of our own existence. It's important to understand that Sartre wasn't writing fiction to teach philosophy in the traditional sense. His goal was to spark awareness. His novels aren't manuals, they're invitations. Reading them becomes an experience that forces the reader to face an uncomfortable mirror. They make us ask, what would I do in this situation? Am I living authentically? Am I owning my freedom or hiding from it? This same intention extends to his plays. Sartre believed the stage was a privileged space to dramatize the moral and existential conflicts that his philosophy laid bare. In plays like No Exit and Dirty Hands, he turns abstract ideas into raw, intense human confrontations. The characters don't represent fixed types. They're, like us, beings in process, full of contradictions, torn between the desire for freedom and the fear of choosing. The famous phrase, "hell is other people," for example, doesn't come from a philosophical treatise. It comes from No Exit. And in that intense confrontation between three people trapped in a single room, Sartre shows us what it means to live under someone else's gaze, what it means to become an object, what it means to have your freedom threatened by another person's judgment. Everything he explores in Being and Nothingness is right there, acted out, lived, deeply human. Sartre believed that writing is always a committed act. There's no such thing as neutral art. All literature, even the kind that pretends to be pure form, carries a worldview. That's why the writer has a responsibility. They must take a side. They must take a stance. Not to push propaganda, but to recognize that writing is a way of intervening, of stepping into the world, of acting through words. In his essay, What is Literature?, Sartre declares, "To write is to make the reader feel that they are free." He believed the reader is not a passive spectator. On the contrary, they're part of the process of creating meaning. The writer offers a world. The reader recreates it through their own interpretive freedom. That's why literature is a meeting between freedoms, a space of existential communication, where the author invites the reader to become a subject, not an object. This perspective radically reshapes the role of the intellectual. Sartre didn't just want to understand the world, he wanted to change it. And for that, he had to move beyond abstract philosophy and step into the living language of literature. Because in literature, thought gains flesh, concepts take on physical form, ideas risk themselves in the real world. And for Sartre, that's the noblest function of philosophy, to act. That's why, throughout his life, Sartre never separated his literary writing from his public activism. He wrote novels and plays with the same seriousness that he wrote political manifestos or took part in protests. It was all part of one mission: to awaken consciousness, to show that we are indeed condemned to be free, but that this condemnation is also our greatest chance to live with truth, courage, and commitment. Literature, then, is not just about aesthetics. It's about ethics. It's political. It's a way of existing in the world with responsibility. Sartre deeply believed that words carry weight. And when used with awareness, they can change how people live. That's why his literary work should never be read as just an illustration of his philosophy. It is philosophy made of flesh, sweat, silence, and action. A philosophy that refuses to remain just an idea, because it knows that real existence only happens when we step into the world and act. For Jean-Paul Sartre, morality doesn't come from eternal commandments, rational formulas, or even social customs. Morality is only possible because we are free. And it's exactly this freedom, concrete, uncomfortable, and non-transferable, that makes ethics possible. Where there is no choice, there is no responsibility. Where there is no freedom, there is no morality. This is one of the deepest and most demanding ideas in existentialism. Sartre isn't just saying we can choose between right and wrong. He's saying something even more radical. Good and evil don't exist before we choose. Values aren't given. They are created in the very act of deciding. Ethics doesn't come before freedom. It's born from it. That changes everything. Traditionally, morality has been seen as a set of universal mandatory rules. From the tablets of the law to Kant's categorical imperative, humans were expected to follow norms that applied to everyone, rules that came from outside, from God, reason, or nature. In this view, freedom was often seen as a problem, a tendency toward disobedience, error, or sin. Ethics was a way to tame freedom. Sartre flips that logic. For him, freedom is not an obstacle to morality. It's the very foundation of it. If we aren't free, then our actions aren't truly ours. If we act purely from instinct, blind obedience, or conditioning, then we're not responsible. And without responsibility, there's no ethics, just behavior. This idea is powerfully developed in his essay, Existentialism Is a Humanism. There, Sartre responds to a common criticism. If there are no objective values, then does anything go? He replies, yes, everything is permitted. And that's exactly why everything we do carries moral weight. Because there is no correct answer waiting to be found. There's no given should. What exists is our freedom in the face of the world and the task to choose, invent, and take ownership. It sounds scary, and it is, because it means we have no excuses. We can't say, I did it because I was told to, or it was my role, or the circumstances made me. Even within the limits of our reality, even surrounded by pressure and conditioning, the choice is still ours. And every choice is an affirmation of value. Sartre insists, when I choose, I'm not just choosing for myself. I'm choosing the kind of human I believe should exist. Every decision is an act of generalization. If I choose to act with honesty, I'm saying, honesty is a value. If I act with cowardice, I'm saying something too. I'm making cowardice an ethical possibility. Every action is a proposal to the world. A way of saying, this is what humanity can, or should, be. This is a deeply ethical view of freedom. Sartre isn't talking about freedom as doing whatever you want. He's talking about freedom as responsibility to ourselves and to others, as the awareness that, in acting, we affect the world and contribute to shaping a certain kind of humanity. And for that, we are responsible not just for ourselves, but also for what we help create. But there's a key nuance. This morality doesn't come from outside the person. It's born from lived experience, from the concrete situation. It's not some abstract moral code that applies to all times and places. It's a grounded ethics, rooted in context, history, and relationships. And that demands more attention, more sensitivity, more presence. It's not about applying rules, it's about creating meaning. Still, this creation is not arbitrary. Sartre isn't saying anything goes. He's saying everything matters, with responsibility. We are free to create values, but we must uphold them with consistency, clarity, and the understanding that our choices shape the world. This isn't relativism, it's commitment. And here lies one of Sartre's greatest contributions to modern ethics, morality as invention and responsibility. He invites us to see ethics not as a list of prohibitions, but as a constant act of creation, born from human freedom confronting reality. Every time we choose, we are creating a world. We are saying what matters. In a way, we are making laws, not for everyone, but for what we are and what we could become. This idea gives us back the dignity of choice. Instead of treating us like children with preset rules, Sartre treats us like adults, like beings capable of creating good, and also of failing, contradicting ourselves, and starting over. Because being free doesn't mean being perfect. It means, above all, being responsible for the consequences. Think, for example, about moments when you had to choose between comfort and truth, between staying silent and speaking out, between safety and justice. In those moments, no rule is enough. There's only you, your freedom, and the weight of the world. That's where ethics is born. Sartre teaches us that morality doesn't come from the outside. It comes from within, from how we choose to respond to what happens to us, from how we embrace or avoid the freedom that defines us, from the courage not to run from responsibility, not to blame others, not to live on autopilot. So freedom is not the enemy of morality, it's what makes morality possible. There is only morality where there is choice. There is only ethics where there is risk, where there is the chance to fail, and also the chance to succeed with authenticity. To live ethically, then, is to live with an awareness of freedom, to not hide behind rules, customs, or authorities, to say, I'm the one who decides, and I accept the weight of that decision. That's moral maturity. That's what it means to truly exist. Thank you so much for making it all the way here. If you've followed every lesson on Jean-Paul Sartre, congratulations. You've taken a powerful step toward understanding not just a philosophy, but a more conscious, free, and responsible way of living. Sartre doesn't offer easy answers. He gives us something far more valuable, the invitation to think for ourselves, to act with authenticity, and to embrace, with courage, the weight and beauty of being free. If this content spoke to you in any way, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep creating reflections that awaken, challenge, and inspire. Don't forget to like this video. It strengthens the message. Share it with someone you believe needs to hear this too. And tell me in the comments, which idea impacted you the most? At what point did you feel challenged? I'd really love to know how these reflections landed with you. And of course, stick around. We've got many more videos on philosophy, ethics, existentialism, and the minds that, just like Sartre, help us see life with more depth. See you in the next video. Until then, remember, living is an act of creation.